And in our fifth and final segment on culture, we've got two objectives. So first is to understand what our three major categories of theory have to say about culture. So our functionalists or structural functionalists, our various conflict theories, as well as symbolic interactionism. It would depend. All right. And I want you to be able to compare and contrast what those perspectives have to say about culture. All right. We're going to start with functionalism. It's the oldest of our theories, the one we've started with. We're going to maintain that order. Not surprisingly, functionalism tells us that culture is part of a functioning society. A society's values, you could also add to this beliefs, ideas, attitudes, guide action. Remember, values are things we think are inherently good or desirable. They guide our action in ways that help us try to achieve those desirable ends or goals. But control is also a part of the functionalist story. Norms, our social rules, and the methods of our social control ensure that society operates smoothly.
Would you recommend plugging the computer in?
Probably so. One example of this is the evolution of the military salute. The origins of today's military salute were the armored knights of Europe. When an armored knight was going through the gate of a fortress or past the skirmish line of guards for maybe a military camp, the norm, the socially agreed upon standard, was to raise the visor of his helmet with his right hand. That did two things. One, it showed at least part of the knight's face so that he might be identified. And since most people are right-handed, this occupied the sword hand of the knight. If he's raising his visor, he can't be drawing his sword to do violence. So that was a sign of respect and also peaceable intent. And of course, today, the military salute continues to ensure functioning of military organizations by expressing respect, who is a subordinate, who is a superior, who gives orders, who follows them, and kind of as a constant reminder of that ingrains the working of a military organization. Now, being that you are all high school students, and even if you have signed some kind of promise to enlist, you're not enlisted yet. So military examples aren't the best for us. I want you to think of and tell us about a norm or a folkway that you think helps our society function. If you're wondering why no mores, as mores are kind of the low-hanging fruit. I don't want you guys telling me why laws against murder are good. I want you to think about some of the maybe less obvious things. Start with a minute on this, add another 30 seconds if we should need it. They really don't. Yep. What is a norm or folkway you think helps our society function? Bless you.
Phew. That was more time.
All right. I'm just going to highlight kind of two here that captured the general themes. Okay, so one were different ways of expressing politeness and respect. And waving is an example of those. I used to do a lot of driving out on the two-lane blacktops of Northwest Missouri, and it used to be a fairly strong norm that you did at least the finger wave as you passed somebody going the opposite direction on the road. That norm is kind of falling out of fashion. Noticed? Well, good for you. I mean, there was a while where I was going to get one of those big foam fingers and just like drive with one of those and wave at people.
That's interesting.
But those things help ensure that society works by expressing respect, acceptance, which makes people feel like they're part of a community and probably, at least we hope, makes them more likely to follow other norms of behavior. Also, more on the very utilitarian side of things, a lot of you highlighted driving or walking on the right side, whether it's a hallway or the road. In the case of driving, that helps ensure that traffic flows smoothly, and in the case of automobile traffic, that not so many people die in head-on collisions.
That's why one-lane bridges are worn.
Yeah. Who'da thunk it?
Hey, there's one-lane bridges that are very dangerous.
Well, that's still true. Next up is conflict theory. And we've got different types of conflict theory. What we're going to hear from today is mostly going to be feminist or gender conflict theory and more Marxist conflict theory. In terms of the feminist or gender conflict theory, we find that culture is a product of male dominance. Remember, if we think back to our most basic conflict theory with Antonio Gramsci, tells us that out of that power struggle, we get the dominant group. The dominant group shapes culture, creates cultural hegemony that makes everybody accept the current power structure as common sense. Gender conflict theorists or feminist conflict theorists would tell us that male dominance is a huge part of our culture. More along the lines of Marxist conflict theory, or more recently what's called post-colonial theory, would highlight the dominance of the West. And by the West, we mean Europe, not just the countries of Europe itself, but countries that were settled and controlled by Europeans, like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, for a long time, South Africa, and depending on who you ask, still South Africa. And this culture that is imprinted by either male dominance or Western dominance or both, right, reinforces the privilege and power of the dominant groups. And in terms of privilege, as Americans traveling to other countries, you have a tremendous cultural privilege. You can speak English just about anywhere and expect that somebody will understand you and be able to communicate with you. Of course, there are exceptions to that if you go into very remote areas without a lot of contact with anybody else outside of those areas. That may not be true, but most places, You can go speak English, be understood, and be replied to in English. It's not just English, right? The same thing can be said of French or Spanish, right? Or Portuguese. Those histories of colonialism mean that hundreds of millions of people, right, can be communicated to in one or more of those languages. And in terms of power, also, again, as an American, you have, this would be true for Europeans too, you have the ability to take your money anywhere in the world and have it accepted. America's money power is referred to by economists as the exorbitant privilege. I think that might be a term from Barry Eichengreen. But that's part of our power. Right? Money is certainly a part of cultural practice. Now, if you were wondering what those images have to do with anything, maybe I just had a moment of early onset dementia and picked the wrong stock photos. No, there's a reason these are here. Both of those are advertisements for skin whitening treatments sold in Asia. And actually, so I put sold in Asia, but I was just in the Hornbill Asian market at the intersection of Belt and Messana yesterday, and behind the counter, you can buy cans of spray-on skin whitening treatment. So it's not just there. It's also being marketed in the United States to Asian immigrants, primarily, is their market. So why might those skin whitening treatments reflect continued Western power and privilege? All right, and let's start with a minute on that. Probably go for another whole minute when that one's up. Okay, now there was a comment that kind of combined both of these really well, but I've kind of split them up here. So one is the standards that were imposed on other cultures. We talked about, Javir, I think it was you that we sent out as a Victorian explorer to measure the races of the world. And as one of those Victorian British explorers, you would have run around with different little swatches of skin tones and classified people hierarchically. The lighter the skin, the higher up in the hierarchy you were. And so those standards were then imposed on other cultures. And as a result, some people in Asia want to follow those Western standards of racial hierarchy, which also plays into this. Right? It's not just a matter of hierarchy, but it is then translated into a beauty standard. And also, some of you pointed out, there's this connection to power. Right? The white Europeans were the ones who were the dominant force in the 20th century, well, the 19th century as well. And so there's some just kind of emulation of those people who were powerful and told you they were powerful because they were better than you. Well done. Now let's look at symbolic interactionism. And remember, symbolic interactionism is about kind of this reciprocal relationship between people and culture. So culture shapes what we do, shapes how we think, but is in turn shaped by our own behavior, right? Especially our interactions with other people. And so culture is therefore created and constantly recreated, either perhaps reinforced in recreation, as in maybe Thanksgiving traditions, or the wearing of makeup, but also recreated in the sense of change based on our interactions with each other. We'll get to that issue of change captured in that third image on the next slide. And that is because symbolic interactionism tells us that cultural innovations, new things, are possible. But the spread is uneven. So you've got two images here. This is not tracking any real data. This is just kind of a perfect bell curve that represents a population. And the vast majority of the population falls here in the middle. And so what we get with a cultural innovation, when something new comes along, there are the innovators. They're the first people, they come up with the idea, or the first ones brave enough to undertake this new practice. Then we get some early adopters, and this is going to be kind of the late majority. We can see that, though, in tracking acceptance of interracial marriage. In 1958 in the United States, only 4% of people accepted it. As we move up this part of the bell curve, right, we also see that there's this other line. What that shows us is the path towards universality, and how kind of it's a steep path and then levels off, but also gets a slow start. We see that in the United States, right? Fairly slow progress through these decades, starting to really pick up those we end the 20th century as we get to the late majority, and now we're at 94%. But there are still the laggards. Right? Now, laggards can sound just insulting. It just means the last people to adopt, or maybe the people who never adopt a cultural innovation. And as we can see from this, there's still about 6% that have not signed on to interracial marriage. It's not just about major kind of hot button social issues. Well, maybe not so much hot button social issues anymore, but about other things. And so the example here would be the smartphone. Smartphones are a key element of material culture, but they have also very profoundly shaped our non-material culture, our practices, right, our attitudes. And what this image shows us is smartphone adoption based on seven different regions of the world. The inner white part of the incomplete circle shows adoption rates as of 2018, and then the yellow outer part of the incomplete circle is adoption rates projected for 2025. And none of those have closed the circle. That's why they're all incomplete, which tells us adoption is not a universal. But let's look at our different stages of adoption. Which part of the world is best described based on that image as the innovator? Choose your option from the 7 available. Take about 20 seconds out of that timer. Okay, and remember, innovators are the people that are the first ones to either invent the thing or to practice it.
Might as well let it expire if it's only 2 seconds.
Yeah, I lose track. All right. And so what we've got is, yes, for North America. And that's it. I mean, that is the birthplace of the smartphone and the place with the highest level of adoption. Which part of the world do you think is best described as one of the early adopters? So kind of still on the left-hand side of that bell curve. Not when we've got to the most places. Let's vote. Let's see if I can actually hold the timer to 20 seconds this time.
20 seconds.
No, it'd be 20 when it hits 10 seconds. 20 seconds out of a 30-second timer.
Oh, sorry.
No, I didn't state that very clearly. All right. And most of you went with Europe. And I think that probably is best case as the early adopter. They have the highest number, not that far ahead of Latin America, but the highest number in 2018, second to the United States. Yeah, Emma.
That's what's important. Is if you're talking about like early adapting, you're talking about 2018 because that's not as
Right. So yeah, I mean, it would be the one closest on the heels of the United States. Okay, and then this one, there's going to be, I expect, probably a wider range of answers. Which part of the world would best be described as belonging to the late majority? That part in the biggest chunk of the bell curve. Not the earliest, not even early adopters, but not laggards. Which one part of the world do you think best represents the middle? Take 20 seconds out of a 30-second timer.
Seconds.
All right. Again, I expected a wider range of answers, and we've got those. Looks like the plurality were for Commonwealth of Independent States, and the second most numerous being Middle East and North Africa. With only one person going with what I would think, and again, there aren't right or wrong answers on this, represents the late majority. Right? Asia Pacific, right, in 2018, not much more than half, right? The same place as the Commonwealth of Independent States, about where Middle East and North Africa was, right, behind Latin America, but by 2025, right, they are projected to be in the same place as Europe, which was our early adopter. So for me, that kind of puts them in late majority, but the other options also certainly fit. I can see why you would have picked those.
Latin America could also do it.
Sure. Okay. And now finally, which part of the world would best be described as laggard? Again, I know laggard sounds derogatory. It's not my term. It's also not really meant to be derogatory in this sense. It's just kind of the people who are the slowest to follow the trend. Take about 10 more seconds out of this timer. All right, and not quite as unanimous as who was the early adopter, but Sub-Saharan Africa, the overwhelming choice. And if we look at the map, it is a little more than a third in 2018 and about 2/3 in 2025. And that's a huge gain. It's nearly doubling. Nobody else does that, but right, they're starting out from a much lower place, right, and they'll still be quite a ways behind the rest of the world. Not as far behind Middle East and North Africa, though, or CIS. Those are kind of different stories. Okay, which leads to this question. Why is sub-Saharan Africa a laggard on the trend of smartphone adoption? Start with a minute on this one. Put another minute on there. Some of you are well in, but it looks like you've got more to say. Yeah, Kevin. There is not an exit slip. Sorry, I didn't see you, Kevin.
It was so technically accurate. Was there never one?
There wasn't one, so no worries. Okay, so kind of two reasons kind of capture the bulk of the comments. So one, smartphones are expensive. The other part is even if you can afford the smartphone, unless you have the cellular infrastructure to make it work, it doesn't. What I didn't see really anybody talking about is that sub-Saharan Africans weren't picking up smartphones because they didn't want them. Right? There was some kind of cultural opposition to the smartphone. Do you think somebody in the United States who doesn't have a smartphone doesn't have one for these same reasons? Or do you think their reasons are different? So it can still be money. I had a student who's like, well, there's some people in my family who can't afford them. But then what's the other category of people in the United States who don't have smartphones?
Some older people.
Yes, people that are opposed to it, people who don't want it. Maybe they don't trust it. They think it's like the apps are going to spy on you. Right? And so they stick to their flip phones or their sliders. So we can have different reasons. And the point I highlight this, I don't want you to think there's something like backward about Africa, that they don't trust technology or don't know how to use it. In parts of Africa where the internet is good, Africans have picked up the smartphone and they use it for all kinds of things. Fishermen in Ghana use it to figure out the best market to take their catch to that day, maybe the fish that are getting the best price. And so they use that to maximize their business. They're very keen on it where they can make it work. Just unfortunately, a lot of parts of that portion of the continent, it doesn't. All right. We're going to stop there. Your notes are finished. You may turn them in. I would wait till you get back from lunch. All right. You guys may get up to pack up. Thank you.
Now it's time for the next.
Yeah.